rock, and embodies community involvement and dedication. One of Oregon's top-flight, homegrown leaders, Earl Blumenauer. Earl has been an Oregon elected official for over 25 years. He was born, raised, and educated in Portland, and has been a lifelong resident of the Congressional 3rd District, which he was elected to represent not once but twice last year by 70% of the vote. Earl was drawn to political and civil action out of the civil rights and anti-war activism of the 1960s, and he began his political career while still at college, chairing a statewide campaign to lower Oregon's voting age. In 1969, he did this, and mind you, he ran for the Oregon State Legislature for the first time in 1972 at the age of 23. There, he authored legislation creating Oregon's Transportation Commission, mandating a multimodal, statewide, comprehensive transportation plan 20 years before the federal government undertook a similar effort. From 1975 to 1978, Mr. Blumenauer chaired the Revenue and School Finance Committee. After completing 3 terms in the Oregon legislature and 2 terms on the Multnomah County Board of Commissioners, Earl was elected to almost 3 terms on the Portland City Council. And while on the City Council, Earl showed his strength as an innovative and effective leader, contributing to Portland's reputation as one of the country's most livable urban areas. Evidence of his leadership includes launching Portland's national award-winning curbside recycling program, initiating the Clean Rivers program, which began the cleanup of the Willamette River, authoring nationally recognized city legislation to take away the cars of drunk drivers. He initiated Portland's regional rail program to expand our rail system and refocused Portland's traffic management efforts to address neighborhood livability, winning national acclaim. I mentioned bicycling. Among his other achievements, he established a bicycling program that won Portland an award as America's best bicycle city in December of 1995. Earl comes to us through the local academic institutions of Lewis and Clark, where he received his undergraduate and law degrees, from graduate studies at Portland State University, and then University of Colorado at Denver, and the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. And I might add tutorials from the late and great Al Lowenstein. Please join me in welcoming our favorite son back to this podium, Representative Earl Blumenauer.
Thank you very much, Chris, for the generous introduction and for setting me up by referencing Charlie's outstanding presentation last week and the publication rights that have already been sold. And I believe there's a movie that's in the process. Chris and I go back a long time, and she hasn't lost any of her punch. I am reminded as she goes through the introduction, I sort of have my life pass in front of my eyes. I have spent my entire adult existence as a City Club member, and it's something that means a great deal to me to be back here amongst friends. Some of you may have heard that I had a little bit of difficult time adjusting to life in Washington, D.C. as a congressperson, going back to a city where you have to boil your water, being dropped out of the sky in sort of the middle of a congressional session where I was sort of a bump on the legislative log and got lots of legislation addressed to Congressman Vacant, sort of putting you in your place. Well, I'm here to say that I think I'm making that transition. I'm glad that we made the effort. It's an honor and privilege to serve you, and I think we're making some real progress. Before I start making my presentation, I would like to make a couple of introductions, if I could. What I found, somebody, when I was walking in, I'm sorry I forgot your name, indicated that you've received several letters from me and wanted me to know that my staff was doing a great job because she had worked for Senator Nunn, and knew that it's impossible for any man or woman in Congress to be able to deal with even a significant fraction of the correspondence. And it is true that one of the reasons why it's fun and interesting and exciting is the people that I get to work with, and they're here. Could I have them stand up? Bob Crane, my Chief of Staff from Washington, D.C., Julia Pomeroy. Why don't we just have the whole crew stand? Because these people aren't doing it because of stock options, and they don't do this work because I'm such a fun guy to be around. They do it because they really have a passion to serve the public, believe in public policy and helping people, and we really want you to get to know them. And we're even having an open house this afternoon in the Weatherly Building at 4 o'clock, and feel free to stop by and get acquainted with them and let them know that you're not getting, that I'm not answering their letters fast enough. So thank you. The first time I made a presentation before the City Club, that I opened my mouth in a microphone, was during a debate between Bob Straub and Tom McCall in 1970 about running, they were running for governor, and I was very excited about that. I'd listened to them, but I asked a question. I can still remember it to this day. I said, you are both against pollution, you're for education, a fair tax system, and you're tall enough to start for any high school basketball team in the state. What's the difference? How are you different? How are we to choose? And they both stumbled to the microphone. There's a little laughter, and they both stumbled to the microphone. And for the next 5 minutes between them, were incapable of distinguishing between the two of them in terms of their values and their commitments. I think one of them was a half-inch higher than the taller than the other. And it was that, for me, was a very interesting moment because what I want to talk about today is something that we struggle with a definition about, the notion of livability and how we make that transition from what we cherish in Oregon to a national level to implement it in policy. And I'm here to tell you, even though it is a subject that is it's my passion, it's my profession, it's my politics, it's my hobby, it infects the circle of friends that I have, it's very hard to capture in words. But I think it is incumbent upon us to try and capture what we're talking about. We in Oregon have grown up around it. It's a lot like Justice, I think it was Stewart, about pornography, that he couldn't define it, but he knew it when he saw it. Well, we know livability when we see it because we've been a part of that. And in fact, the two gentlemen that I just mentioned, Tom McCall and Bob Straub, were, I think, giants in Oregon, and an amazing team in their own way, good friends, friendly adversaries, the way that partisan politics should be. They had some difference, but it didn't obscure their commitment to Oregon and their ability to work together. In fact, they had an odd sort of symbiosis that was working here because, as many of you know, many of the landmark ideas were really proposals that Bob Straub came up with. But Bob was better at thinking them up, and Tom was better at promoting them, and between the two of them, Oregon was the winner. Well, you think about that landmark legislation, the bottle bill, the Willamette Green bill, the beach bill, Senate Bill 100, some very hard decisions that were made in transportation, cashing in the Mount Hood Freeway for light rail and transportation improvements around the area. And you get a flavor for what we're talking about with livability. I feel that we can't afford not to be more precise about that approach. And I'd like to spend a few minutes telling you what I think it is, and it really is a little more tentative than I would like. I have 4 different versions of this speech, and some of you in this room, I've inflicted ideas upon you. I've robbed shamelessly, trying to refine it. And I'd like you to work with me in terms of how we can make this better in terms of capturing and communicating what we mean about livability, what it means to Oregonians, and what it can mean for the country. Let me say what it is not. It is not about gadgetry or a particular mode. It's not light rail. It's even in a post-Measure 47, post-Measure 5 era, it's not about money. And if we focus on money, I think we're looking at the wrong end of this problem. What we need is to have a vision, a plan, and public support, and I believe even under these strange strictures that we've had inflicted upon us, if we do that, we'll be able to get the resources to do the job. It is about building community. There may well be some here in this room who still disagree with the notion that we have a zoo station, a stop at the #1 paid tourist attraction in the state of Oregon, something that is that has, I think, a dramatic potential for the future, because they're concerned about 75 seconds faster running time for suburban people to get to downtown Portland. It's a different sort of philosophy about what we mean about these systems. Well, I would suggest what we're talking about is building livable communities. The principles are, first and foremost, from where I sit, it deals that people can afford to live in a livable community. Housing is available, and where and how people live, the opportunity for home ownership really helps define a livable community. In a livable community, you have a range of transportation options. You are not just a captive of an automobile. It's going beyond the 20% of our population who can't or shouldn't drive, and it speaks to those who don't want to drive, or for whom transit, walking, biking, rollerblades, this is better for them in terms of their lifestyles. Wheelchairs, baby carriages. A livable community gives people those choices. A livable community feels safe. And it's not just that it is safe. We can sit up here with all sorts of charts and graphs and arrest rates and let you know that crime is going down, and if you don't feel safe, it's not good enough. You've got to make that sort of commitment to entrust your family to the streets, to the roads, to the schools. A livable community goes beyond simply police officers and jail cells. It's the chemistry in a community that makes people know that they and their family are safe. A livable community is one that has it creates an environmentally and economically sustainable future for their children. And we have to look at the environment and the business and the economy interwoven. No community is going to be penalized economically for being too healthy, too clean, for the air and the water being too pure. And indeed, the jobs of the next century that we're all focusing on are not going to locate where people don't want to live, and they're not going to want to live in a place that isn't healthy for them and their families. Finally, and perhaps most importantly in terms of the principles, I think a livable community is where people can participate in shaping that community. On at least 2 other occasions from this podium, I have argued that citizen participation is not something you just check off a list. It's not something the federal government requires you to do or that you think you want to do. The things that we're most proud of in this community that are landmark achievements are the result of citizens being involved in all levels, the push, the pull, the tug. They make our accomplishments better. It is not just an afterthought. How do we create these livable communities? Well, I would suggest that we ought to focus on inexpensive, low-tech solutions. Chris mentioned taking away the cars of repeat drunk drivers. Pretty simple connection, but it's cost-effective. It gets the point across. Street trees, speed bumps, having people on the street to provide security in terms of having more social interaction. Many of the things that we are most excited about really don't cost very much if we do it right. Find the other list here. I really have to operate this way. I cannot read a speech. It's even worse than when I give it extemporaneously, and so I end up doing these bizarre things, for which I apologize. A livable community achieves many of these things by providing incentives rather than regulations. It isn't driven by thou shalts. If we can help people understand, and provide incentives for the right sorts of behaviors, it's far, far more powerful and more effective, and we unharness their ingenuity, creativity, and their enthusiasm. A livable community is built through partnerships. I'll tell you, I could not disagree more with the sentiment that some people are arguing in Washington, D.C. about devolution. You know, sort of get it out of our, give it to somebody else and sort of pass that stuff down. I personally don't trust any level of government to run with billions of dollars and solve problems. Maybe it's because I've spent too much time around some legislators from Louisiana and Mississippi, or I just came back from Salem this week. I don't know. But it seems to me that it works best if we're talking about partnerships, not the number of levels of government, local, state, federal, where we're able to harness the civic energy, business leadership, grassroots activism, churches, dare I say the City Club, which has been in the forefront. I counted 57 City Club reports in the last 20 years that I would categorize as being involved with livability. Partnerships work, and we ought to be strengthening them, and I think they're essential in a livable community. We want to have solutions that create the sort of the synergy. The buzzword that's been given to me is multi-objective management. Thank you, Mike Houck, burned into my brain. But the notion here is that you just can't spend every dollar once, but you want to think of creative ways of spending those resources to achieve multiple results. The Central City Transportation Management Plan, which a number of you have been involved with, is a way to solve congestion and air quality problems downtown, not by adding capacity, but how we make these pieces come together, and housing and parking management as a way to achieve capacity. The light rail system is a way to add capacity without creating additional problems. The CSO problem, the combined sewer overflow, that's going to cost us hundreds of millions of dollars. If we view it as an opportunity to create linear parks, to daylight creeks, to involve communities in projects like the roof drain disconnect, we can come out of this with a huge amount of momentum, positive goodwill, and accomplishments, rather than just a project that requires us to dig holes in the ground and get rid and store stormwater. And finally, you achieve it by making that citizen participation that we talk about, make it meaningful, be creative in terms of how you use it. And it goes beyond the hearings and the committees. We've had exciting conferences that are here. The City Club, again, has been looking for ways to make that dynamic in terms of bringing people in, particularly young people. We've had, I think, this is the 11th seminar we've had at Portland State University, 11 semesters, where the city has paid people to attend a transportation class so they know how to yell at us about transportation. And we've got 400 alumni who really help us do a better job. And I think maybe doing more actual education of citizens is another way to be able to bridge that gap in terms of citizen participation. These, at least for me, are some of the tools to achieve that livable community objective. What difference does that make? Why should a congressman from Portland, Oregon be concerned about that livable community's agenda and translating it to the federal level? I'd be prepared to suggest that first and foremost, we have to today find different ways to build relationships in Congress, to make the transition. We can't rely on the formula that we've had in the past with very powerful congressional delegations. That era ended with the retirement of Senator Hatfield, and even though I think we have an able team that is working well now and has great potential for the future, it is going to be some time, if ever, that we have the alignment of committee assignment, seniority, and personality that enabled this region to have disproportionate influence for virtually this entire century. That era is gone. being able to build bridges with a livable communities agenda is a way of making that translation. Times have changed even if we had that powerful lineup. The era of earmarking and slipping things in bills and moving it forward and finding $10 million there and log rolling, that isn't going to happen again in our lifetime. It is a different way of doing business. And the way that we're going to do business is to accomplish what we want in Oregon for protecting the environment, transportation, infrastructure, education, is to convince people in the various committees in Congress that we've got a better way, that this is the solution. And we need it for the sake of America. There is no doubt in my mind that the models that we in Oregon have been able to pioneer, not just in the metropolitan area, but the Oregon Health Plan and welfare and benchmarking, are part of the solutions that are going to enable us to make that bridge to the next century that is so in vogue, and balance the budget and not leave anybody behind. You can't do it without constructing livable communities. I have some personal biases about what it is that I should be doing over the next couple of years to make that transition. First and foremost, in my daily routine, in committee, on the floor, votes, I need to view legislation through that prism of livable communities and the objectives that I just mentioned. And I need to act and vote in ways that are consistent and be able to express that in an articulate and forceful fashion when the opportunities arise in the course of my day-to-day work. Second, by selecting key pieces of legislation to try and illustrate livable community principles. I've got a little bill in Congress that suggests that the U.S. Post Office should abide by local land use regulation. I know it's... What can I say? What can I say? I have another bill. We'll see if it works this well. I call it Give Fans a Chance. Some of you are aware that little Green Bay, Wisconsin, smaller than Eugene, Oregon, has won more professional championships in the last 35 years than any other franchise in the NFL. 1/34th the size of Los Angeles, which doesn't have a team at all. Although I didn't see the sports page this morning, maybe they bought one. Or somebody moved there, more to the point. I have a piece of legislation that suggests that maybe the NFL ought not to have a rule prohibiting any more Green Bays. Do you know they have a rule that prohibits community ownership? It seems to me that if they get an exemption from antitrust that enables them to have a $1.2 billion television revenue contract last year, that at least they ought not to restrain communities from having the opportunity to own a franchise. I had an interview last week for over an hour with an associate editor from U.S. News and World Report who caught wind of the legislation and was irate about what one community was going through, and he thought this was an interesting bill. We started the conversation. Literally 10 minutes into the discussion, he said, "You're not talking about the NFL. You're talking about livability and community control and people being involved." We said, bingo. We gave him a package of information about a Livable Communities Caucus that we want to start. But sometimes specific pieces of legislation will enable us to get the point across about what a livable community is. Third, I have joked, and some of you have heard me a little bit, about making the transition from Portland, Oregon, I don't care what they say, America's most livable city, to Washington, D.C. was a bit of a transition where, you know, you can't run after dark. Put aside safety, the sidewalks are missing. I mean, people disappear. I wasn't joking about boiling the water. But the treatment of Washington, D.C., our nation's capital, a huge interactive museum, the capital of the free world, is a disgrace. And you're going to see your congressman spending a little time trying to spiffy it up, in part because it's the right thing to do for the country and the 7.5 million people who attended, including many of your children and grandchildren. We welcome them. We like to have them there to see it. But also because our nation's capital is going to be a model, for good or ill, about whether or not we can govern cities. And I think that it's got to be on my list, and I think everybody else's list, to be able to put these principles to work. I think on that list has to be real campaign finance reform. I have seen in my short stint how the way that campaigns are financed in this country distorts the decision-making process. We would not have nearly the number of people who die each year from tobacco-related deaths if it weren't for the influence of tobacco money in politics. And I think most of the people that I work with are honest and sincere, and I don't think that it is necessarily something that I want to burn down. But the fact is that the way the system is financed now does distort, and it has some very negative consequences, and it's got to be changed. There is a cloud over it in terms of people's perceptions, and in terms of people that are there to do the work. They're spending too much time on the phone raising money, and it's sort of an arms race. I think as part of a livable community's agenda, I need to support any meaningful campaign finance reform that keeps a level playing field, that doesn't tilt in favor of Republicans or Democrats, doesn't unduly help incumbents, and cuts down the amount of time that people spend in the pursuit of campaign money. And last but not least on my sort of list of priorities is building a coalition around the country on the livable communities agenda. We need allies. And I'm taking part of my work plan, spending a day or two a month, unfortunately these are usually weekends, in other cities, trying to be sort of Johnny Appleseed about how these pieces work, talking about the Oregon story, cultivating friends, and trying to change national opinion. That's my short list in terms of what I think I should be doing. But I think there's something that needs to happen here in Oregon to complement it, to make our efforts more effective, to make it more likely that we'll get the resources and the partnership and the attention that we need. And I would suggest that what we have to have is a little bit of an Oregon agenda here. We need to sort of not take livability for granted. We need to generate some momentum. We are in danger, I think, of falling behind in a number of areas. I would suggest a few items that ought to be on that Oregon agenda, that we don't wait for a few people who are just frustrated politicians who've been rejected at the polls themselves when they've tried to obtain office, but they've got a formula, sort of a little cottage industry, and a few people that'll back them, and they keep lobbing things up, and they define the public policy agenda, and we are in turn forced to react. It's not good enough. Ultimately, we lose the potential of moving forward in a positive sense. I think we need to get the light rail agenda back on track. There's no... And part of that is just being honest and direct and forthright about what has happened. We had a crummy instrument, and some of us, maybe we could have done a better job in terms of the campaign, but that was the fourth consecutive time that people in the metropolitan area overwhelmingly voted for light rail. And our job is to work with them to keep faith, to refine, to move forward with those partnerships and deliver on it. I'd suggest there are things we can do to regenerate that momentum. Let's have Fairless Square open to the Lloyd District in September. And I know there may be lots of complex things that people want to do. All we have to do is run Max off-peak between here and the Lloyd Center, and that'll be good enough. And we can do that by September. While we're at it, why don't we extend Max the other way? That you've seen what's happened, Max to Goose Hollow, it looks superb. Let's start, when those new cars come, let's run Max to the west to serve Civic Stadium, the Mac Club, Lincoln High School, and Bud Clark has been so patient with the Goose Hollow Inn, you know? Bud on the council voted against his economic interest because it was right for the community. Well, let's get Max up to the Goose Hollow Inn for Bud. Let's have the most dynamite opening of West Side Rail in the fall of 1998. It'll be the momentum we need to carry forward on the project that a number of you are working on with the streetcar, which is real, which is not a toy, and can serve neighborhoods throughout the city. And I had another point that I thought was very important there. And I can't remember what it was. How frustrating. But you get the idea. We've got those things that are there and they're moving, and when we put it back on the ballot, and legally we probably don't have to put it back on the ballot, but I think we should, to give a chance for voters to reaffirm the new program and to keep that momentum going in November of 1998. Governor Kitzhaber appeared before you in his State of the State, and he previewed one of the best, most innovative transportation finance packages you'll find anywhere in the world. The legislatures down there, they don't quite know what to do with it yet, but it is perfect in terms of linking the use and the growth and the expansion with incentives to reward the right sort of behaviors. You ought to have a program on that transportation package, and people ought to get behind it and make it work and tie utilization of vehicles and growth to the financing mechanism. That was built, the process that led to that transportation plan, managed by our friend Bill Robertson and involving people from all over the state, is a textbook case on Oregon solutions. And we ought to get behind it and make it work. And if we can't get it through the legislature, we ought to initiate it and pass it, because Oregon deserves it. And speaking of direct action, if our friends in Salem cannot figure out a way intellectually and politically to deliver the kicker to make sure that we're putting resources behind the education system, then we all ought to take out the petitions and pass that, because Oregonians will pass it in a heartbeat to protect our education system. And a livable community has an education system that people want to put their children in. Other issues that I won't go into, but there are people here in this room that are willing to talk to you about. The Columbia River Gorge, a national treasure. For a few pennies compared to what we're talking about with these other things, we can preserve and protect it for centuries to come. That not to be something that's languishing. We ought to get a hold of it, shake it up, and move forward with it, and it's something we can be proud of. I mentioned the zoo, the #1 paid attraction. I think the Gorge is the #1 tourist attraction in the Pacific Northwest, and we need to do more to make sure that that landmark legislation is built upon and that heritage is preserved. 2040. There are a number of people here working with that. That's something we need to follow through on as individuals, putting an ongoing effort behind the successful enaction of 2040 that's meaningful. The citizens are ahead of the politicians and the special interests on that, and that's something that all of us need to be able to take special ownership and follow through on. Last but not least, I would suggest that the real estate transfer tax that is been offered up to the legislature, but I'm told is dead on arrival, ought to be viewed as an opportunity to have a fee to protect growth and livability, a growth and livability surcharge. And 1% buried in a real estate transaction is something that comes at a time when all of us can handle it. And I would suggest that dedicating those resources to affordable housing, to infrastructure, to open space preservation, and part of it going back to the half of the state that is the most economically disadvantaged, is something that Oregonians, again, would get behind. And I think if we can't get it through the legislature, we ought to refer it, and it will be give us the resources. It'll be a livability fund for the state of Oregon. I'll conclude with a notion of benchmarking. Some of you know that I have long argued that the City Club ought to have midterm debates, that nobody should be allowed to debate before an election unless they promise to come back midway through their term, same two, win or lose, and debate what's happened in the last 2 years. I mean, how much could the City Club have raised on a Neil and Norma midterm? You know? We wouldn't, the foundation would be 100. That same sense of accountability, the Oregon benchmarks, Governor Roberts is here, Governor Goldschmidt's fingerprints are on that. It continues. It's something that we all take pride in. I hope that we'll deal with that benchmarking, that you will do that with me. These things that I've talked about today, that the appropriate committees will feel free to haul me back, to appear, to talk about it, and that at some appropriate period of time that I can be held accountable to you, sort of benchmark my behavior to make sure that I am behaving the way that you want in following through on achieving this livable communities agenda. And with that, I'd be happy to turn to the most exciting part of the program, the chance for any interaction.
Thank you very much, Representative Blumenauer, for your visionary remarks, your good humor, and especially your willingness to represent all of us in Washington. You've pretty much knocked off the questions I viewed as the ones I really wanted to ask by giving us wonderful answers. You're clearly interested in a balanced budget. Do we need the balanced budget amendment, in your view? No.
As I mentioned before, we do have an announcement from Jack Beatty about the initiative and referendum process, to which Representative Blumenauer alluded. And then we will take questions from the floor. Please line up behind Judge Beatty before he's completed his questions, so there'll be no lag time.
Well, I was just asked to make a brief report on the status of the initiative and referendum, and I think you would like to know that the Oregon Initiative Committee has been organized. It's been organized on a statewide basis. It is not an organization by the City Club, although some City Club members belong to it. It contains members from all around the state as the founding group, and it's thoroughly bipartisan. Mark Hatfield, Beverly Clarno, and Dave Frohnmeyer are Republicans who belong to it, and Cliff Troe and Hardy Myers and Bob Straub are some of the Democratic members. And we're at work as a group, getting started. All of the people who become associated with it understand that we're in this for the long haul. We're determined that changes have to be made to improve the process and to protect the functioning of state and local government in the next few years. So we're on our way, and we hope to hear from everybody.
Randy Strode, City Club member. I believe a lot of what you said touched on what I'm trying to ask, but I'll ask anyway. I think it's fair to say that you have a long-term view of the issue of Portland versus the rest of Oregon, and I think you have a new perspective now. Can you offer an improved vision of the Oregon community livability, Oregon as a whole? A little more focused than...
Thank you. I do hope that it's clear that occasionally I fall into old habits where I talk about Portland, but the issues that we're talking about, there are examples around the state. Main Street, Gresham is every bit as a good an example as Southeast Hawthorne, Northwest 23rd in terms of revitalization. These principles that we're talking about in terms of some of the smaller communities in terms of revitalization apply. And I think a livable community agenda also includes tying the state together. Every single state that I've had a chance to work in suffers this upstate, downstate, rural, urban split. And the things that we do in terms of having making common cause, what I mentioned, I'd have part of the real estate transfer tax dedicated from areas that are thriving to areas that aren't. To help in that is a positive demonstration of that effort. And I apologize if sometimes my terminology obscures the fact that I really do believe this includes all of the state, and we need to work to make sure that that happens.
B.J. Seymour, City Club member. You mentioned housing several times in your presentation, and with all the people that Oregon's livability is drawing to move here and the projected increases in population, how do we go about maintaining affordability of housing, and what, if anything, is the federal role in that?
I think the key is one of supply. The federal role, I mean, I don't like to see the federal government back away in terms of providing resources for the poorest of the poor, no-income citizens. I also think that there are partnerships that are available because there are, in this community, people who are in the lower end of the income scale but are already paying now more in rent than is necessary to support owning their own sort of piece of the rock. And the efforts to provide no-interest loans or grants that can be recovered when the sale of the house takes place. I think there are a whole host of things that we can do to increase supply, increase home ownership. Part of it is just sound land use planning, because it isn't just the cost of rent, but it is truly the total cost of living. And if we are spread all over the countryside, having higher utility rates, higher transportation bills, because we don't have compact development that works, that is not affordable for people, and they don't have enough money left over at the end of the day to pay for housing. So I think part of what's going on with 2040 is a part of a comprehensive solution that will make it cheaper for people to live here in the aggregate.
Mike Burton, City Club member. Congressman, when you were waxing so eloquently about the innovative options in transportation and you sort of blanked there for a minute, I think you may have been thinking about light rail to the airport, perhaps, but I'll fill that one in. That isn't my question.
You're right.
It's a public-private partnership. I think it really was. I think that's what you were, I just sensed that. I had that.
I just got a memo.
We were connecting. It was good. My question really is not related to that. I'm someone who doesn't believe in term limits because I think the voters get to do that every 2 or 4 years, and that's the right way to do that. But I am concerned about the seniority system, particularly in Washington. When you talk about campaign finance reform and these types of things, the money flows to those chairs who have an enormous amount of power. And while in some cases that can do some good, I think that may be what part of the problem is. Is there any discussion ever going about trying to take a look at that part of the system and what are your reflections in your first rounds out there on that?
Well, I actually supported Congressman Dingell's amendment to term limits. I personally think this notion that stop me before I vote again is just antithetical to what I think democracy is like. I voted for John Dingell's amendment to term limits, which is just basically whatever term limit you pass, it's retroactive. if you're upset with entrenched politicians, it's not the entrenched politicians 10 years from now, it's the entrenched politicians today. And John Dingell, God love him, who was elected to Congress before anybody in this room was born, got up and said, this is horse hockey. And we got 152 votes for that amendment, that whatever it is, it's retroactive. I think we need to focus in terms of performance for people on committees, not just seniority, but what they do. And I think both caucuses, Republicans and Democrats, House and Senate, need to think about having some standards for performance. There are now secret ballots in our caucus about who the ranking member will be or who the committee chair will be. But I think it's really a case, it's not just when you're elected and you're there and it's automatic and whatever you do is your business. I think the Republicans and the Democrats need to hold people in Congress accountable for their legislative work in committees, and that will help change the dynamic. And I hope that that's something that actually almost 2/3 of Congress has been elected since 1990. So there is, I think, a move with some newer people that might help focus on that.
Ray Polani, a City Club member. You mentioned livable communities, and of course it's very important how the livable communities are linked. We are moving in the valley with the high-speed rail linking us to Seattle and Vancouver, BC. But at the same time, Amtrak talks about discontinuing the service on the other link east, I-84. Pendleton, LeGrand, Baker, Boise, Salt Lake eventually. And of course, they're also planning to discontinue service to Texas and to Vegas and Los Angeles. This will happen in May unless something happens. What do you think you can do to not only restore the service, but improve actually the service? Amtrak needs to be funded more, and unfortunately the administration is cutting back on that. Rail is an essential part of linking communities, livable communities. What do you think can be done?
Well, first and foremost, we need to follow through on the capital program. We need the legislature. I put this in part of my IST submission, is that we move ahead with upgrading the tracks. I think we continue to, I think that you have to think intermodally. The easiest way to get increased capacity for I-5 is to upgrade the tracks and put people on Amtrak. It's the quickest way to get capacity at SeaTac and at the Portland International Airport. Which one of us would not like to walk out here? It is less than a 2-hour ride from Transit Mall to Transit Mall, Portland to Seattle. We'd take it in a minute if the tracks were upgraded and there'd be enough business to sustain it. And there's enough money that we're spending now on airports, highways, that I think being able to redeploy it and fighting under ICE-T to keep that flexibility. We've got under ICE-T right now, we have enough flexibility to meet our transportation needs if we can pull it out of the trust funds and spend it. In fact, we don't have to change one state constitution. We can flex in Oregon, we can flex hundreds of millions of dollars right now under the existing ICE-T legislation and put money into transit, put money into Amtrak. So we need to preserve ICE-T, we need to look for the flexibility, we need to keep that drumbeat, and we need to make these experiments that are going right now between, for example, Portland and Seattle, we need to keep them alive and grow. It's part of the same equation. We're going to try and have the 4.3 cents that are currently identified for deficit reduction. We're working to try and put that into transport, the 4.3 cent gas tax, put that into transit, both for Amtrak subsidies and for transit around the country.
Dan Goldie, member. In answer to Fran's question at the beginning, do we need a constitutional amendment to balance the budget? You said one word answer, no. But it's about to come up for a vote. in the House, Senate, and 1,100 economists, including 9 Nobel Prize winners, have indicated that if the constitutional amendment to balance the budget passes, is enacted, it would mean another devastating depression like we had in the 30s, which, if it happened, would be the end of livable communities as you're talking about it. My question is, when it comes to a vote, what's going to happen? What's your reading on it? And will we get the kind of, in the Senate, the kind of gutsy vote, principled vote that we got from Senator Hatfield the last time when his was the critical vote to turn it down?
You are, I think, absolutely right, Dan, in terms of, I don't know about how cataclysmic, it's just something we don't need. It has the potential of tremendous harm. It has the potential of turning over the government operations. We saw a majority willing to shut down government. In this case, 40% of government could be shut down by these folks. My sense is that it will not pass. There has been almost a unanimous position, everything from the Wall Street Journal to the New York Times and everything in between, saying no, it's stupid, it's not the way to go. Also, this has been fueled by a sort of focus group approach to politics and bumper sticker legislation. And I think that that's starting to lose its steam. I mean, I think maybe you can win an election, but it has no staying power. This is something that doesn't have any staying power. We have the lowest deficit now of any of the industrialized countries, and if we have the discipline to follow through, we can achieve further progress. I think it's close in the Senate. I think it's less likely to pass in the House. I don't think, though, in the final analysis that it will go through both houses. It's just my guess. And Mike, you were right. The point that I didn't have mentioned was light rail to the airport. To complete that before we finish the construction out there in about the year 2000, we can in fact do that without any federal money, and it might make it easier for us to get additional federal money for South North. I did want to close that loop.
This will have to be the last question.
Joe Eusterman, member. Congressman Blumenauer, I've always been impressed with the sense of your wanting to do the right thing throughout your career. I think that's always a sense I've had of you, and I'm pleased to be able to have the opportunity to say that. With that in mind, and with your staff here, I thought it might be appropriate to inquire as to what is the status in our nation's capital of legislators' staffs. From time to time, we hear about excesses and problems, so on, with staff members of legislators maybe assuming too much authority. And what is the status of that? Are there any movements toward ethical guidelines for legislators' staffs in the Capitol?
Well, there are waves of proposals for ethics that apply to not just members but to staff. In fact, there are those who argue that we've taken it a couple of steps too far. I cannot have anybody volunteer in my office. Say somebody in this room decides they want to sell their business and they want to specialize in tax advice to me, or they want to just meet people and they want to volunteer to be in my Portland office. Ethics rules don't permit that. Because there were some excesses at some point in the past. I think we've reached a point where it's almost to lengths that are too extreme. I think what you do is by having the system open, by having people accountable, by reforming campaign finance and reducing some of these ancillary pressures, there'll be more time for people to do their jobs, everybody to do their jobs, and it will allow us to focus more on the policies and less on the politics. And so I would guess that's the approach that I would like to see us take. Thank you very much.
Congressman Blumenauer. We will delight in benchmarking your behavior over the next quarter of a century of your years of public service, which we look forward to. We treasure you as an essential ingredient of the chemistry of the community that you've described. And I would ask all of you to join us next Friday for our power lunch. We are adjourned.